Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Connected Conversation, a program conducted by the Idaho Humanities Council. If you're not familiar with our organization, I encourage you to check out our website, idahohumanities.org. I'd like to remind you all that you may submit any questions using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of the screen. We will not be using the chat feature. With me tonight is Steve Pine from Arizona State University. It's an honor to have you with us tonight. I turn it over to you.
Well, it's an honor to be here. And it's always a pleasure to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is fire. In this case, we'll look at the last 150 years or so of fire. Why does the fire scene in the US look the way it does today? Well, part of it is a result of how it evolved historically. So let me give you some background on that. This is a useful place to start. Believe it or not, the 1880 census included a map of forest fires. The darker areas are more frequently burned. In some ways resembles what we see today. In some ways, it's dramatically different. It does not include, by definition, grasslands, deserts, and so forth, places that are not forested. So what it's recording by way of fires are those fires set by nature, by lightning, all those fires set by people, and almost all of those were embedded in agriculture in some form or another. And then a new disturbance in the forest, aptly illustrated by this Currier and Ives print of a locomotive across the prairie, dividing the world into two realms of combustion. And indeed, this transition to fossil fuels will be the great driver in shaping the modern scene certainly over the past century. Well, in 1880, America was pretty much the Brazil of its day, generally condemned for its abusive burning. Our first professional forester, an emigre from Prussia, Bernard Fernot, dismissed the whole scene as one of bad habits and loose morals. It was simply considered a problem of social behavior. Fire was not considered an ecological presence of any significance or value. And there were a lot of bad burns. Settlement across the country, converting land to agriculture, a lot of land clearing, enormous amounts of logging, huge mountains of slash left on the landscape. And these are all scenes from late 19th, early 20th century of what the burns could do. And this provided a background, an argument for the state to intervene in what was really a global project called conservation. Something would have to stand between this sort of reckless use of the axe and laissez-faire burning to preserve something for future generations. That task was, there are lots of different groups competed for the task in a sense, but in the US as globally, it fell to foresters, especially identified with this guy, Gifford Pinchot, who headed the Bureau of Forestry and later the US Forest Service. He studied for a while under Dietrich Brandis, a German botanist who set up the British Indian Forest Service, which became the basis for forestry throughout the British Empire. And Pinchot, even before he headed the Forest Service, was making declarations like this one that, like the question of slavery, the question of forest fires may be shelved for some time at enormous cost in the end, but sooner or later it must be met. And if any of you are fans of Kipling, you might wonder what happens to Mowgli after he grows up. And since I've already introduced British India through Brandis, it turns out that Kipling wrote a short story that describes what Mowgli does. He joins the Indian Forest Service and becomes a forest guard, one of whose primary tasks is to deal with jungle fires, as they were called. And I like it because it shows the breadth of international interest in fire. So very usefully, we have a kind of creation story, a moment, which also for this audience usefully deals in the Northern Rockies. In 1910, what became known as the Great Fires or the Big Blowup, in a sense, it created an American way of fire, which was different than all the rural fires, many of them large, giant mega fires and very deadly fires. But this was different. An agency committed to conservation would have to be responsible. The Forest Service responded. 3.25 million acres burned in the Northern Rockies alone, much of that on August 20 and 21. All the pieces that would become the way we now recognize all the callouts, the emergency funding, all the controversies during and after the fire were all present. So the whole package, in a sense, crystallizes out in this one moment, of which one of the enduring emblems, of course, is this scene featuring a mine shaft outside of Wallace, Idaho, where Ranger Edward Pulaski held his crew at gunpoint while the firestorm raged around them. Afterwards, what to do with rehabilitating all of the damaged infrastructure? What about salvage logging? What about replanting or rehabilitating the landscape? All of these questions still very much with us, were all rehearsed fully then. The whole characteristic of organizing crews, calling people from all over, including the Army. Here would be a typical crew flushed out of wherever they could find workers. And unhappily, what to do with all the dead. 85 people died, 78 firefighters in 6 different incidents, all at essentially the same time during the Big Blowup, many of them unidentified even as to name. That same month, August, however, a controversy boiled over in California, in Northern California, became known as light burning. And a group argued that the Forest Service approach to fire was fundamentally wrong, that instead of looking to Europe and a kind of paramilitary firefight against the flames, we should be emulating the American Indian, who routinely burned at least the montane forests, and in that way kept it open, kept fuels from building up, kept the forests healthy. This was taken as a very serious challenge. And it was not until the mid-1920s that it was officially condemned. It, in some ways, just went underground and then later resurfaced. But the light burning was taken as a political challenge to the Forest Service and to conservation in general. Pinchot and others. Pinchot said that you're either with us against us on this. The chief forester at the time condemned it as Paiute forestry. And here's Aldo Leopold, as late as 1920, while he's setting up a Forest Service fire protection system in the Southwest, arguing against light burning and the challenge that it poses. So again, this is not easily interpreted in the terms that we understand today, but the issues that we're still debating were front and center then, and in fact, one can trace them back to British India or French imperial projects and the rest of it. And one final element, August 1910, William James, one of our great philosophers, Harvard professor, one of the architects of pragmatism, published his final essay. James was dying in his summer cottage in New Hampshire. The smoke from the 1910 fire is passing overhead, turning the sun over Boston to a coppery color. And James, alarmed at what he saw as a growing militarism throughout Western civilization, a martial enthusiasm that would end in the trenches of World War I in a few years, wanted to find some way to redirect all of that energy to constructive purposes. So he argued that we needed to rally against our common foe, which was the forces of nature, and that there should be a moral equivalent of war in the same way that there was a mechanical equivalent of heat. So there it is, the 1910, from Ed Pulaski to William James. The country could rally around the great firefight. It was a time of political activism, the progressive era. Teddy Roosevelt, no longer president, is calling for a life of strenuous endeavor, and fighting on the Forest Service model seemed to answer that challenge well. 3 future chiefs were personally on the fire line: Greeley, Stewart, and Silcox. That entire generation would be branded by the fires. It was a kind of Valley Forge or Long March moment. Congress responded in 1911 by creating the Weeks Act, which um, allowed the national forests to expand by purchase. The target here was really the Appalachian Mountains, which were badly cut over and burned over. But it also set up a federal state cooperative program for forestry, which would be founded on fire control. And hence we could create a national infrastructure. Well, that really inaugurates a 50-year era organized around and by the U.S. Forest Service, a policy of suppression, of fire exclusion as much as possible, and pretty much a project of hegemony in all aspects. By the 1960s, however, this project, the wheels are starting to fall off, and there are challenges, intellectual challenges, practical challenges, institutional challenges. We began a program of trying to restore fire, good fire, distinguishing between good and bad fire, which the earlier era didn't do, and to introduce a pluralism of purposes and of institutions. And then I think the last decade or so, we seem to be inflecting into yet another era. So let's follow these quickly through. A lot of energy and innovation applied to put fires out all across the country. That middle one is from Arkansas, North Carolina in the lower right, California. Well, they're going to put a car on it. There's fire control in Alaska. One guy would ride this thing between Anchorage and Fairbanks once a week. A lot of technical innovations, hand tools invented, and eventually in California, the idea evolved to putting a movable blade on the front of one of these tractors instead of just pulling plows, and gave us the modern bulldozer and war surplus equipment. A public relations spectacular, the use of Army biplanes and pilots, Forest Service observers to begin reconnaissance of fire in the backcountry. But still, there were limits to what you can do. The backcountry was a long way out, few roads, few trails, few lookouts, few telephone lines. And there was also a different backcountry, all that cut over, burned over land that had been abandoned. And so at some point, we would have to take on these two kinds of remote lands. And the solution is basically the New Deal. Its interest in conservation, rehabilitating society and economy and land, all as one grand program. The Civilian Conservation Corps put hundreds of thousands of young men to work on projects. It's estimated that about half of all they did involved fire control or pre-suppression in one form or another. So almost overnight, we are able to create an infrastructure to manage fire, and we have camps of people who can be sent out to fight them. 1934, essentially a year after the CCC is created, fires break out again in the Northern Rockies, in the Selways. Gus Silcox, now chief forester, had been the #2 man in 1910. Wants to know what we should do with these fires deep in the backcountry. He calls a group together. They meet at Missoula, and out of that convocation, Silcox announces the 10 a.m. policy, or what one universal standard to control every fire by 10 o'clock the morning after its report, or if you fail, then plan to control by 10 a.m. the next day, and so on. A policy really unthinkable unless you have unlimited resources, and that's exactly what Silcox had. The CCC did enormous projects. This is a part of a 650-mile-long fuel break that spanned the entire west front of the Sierra Nevada. And by the end of the 30s, thanks to selective use in the CCC's camps, we have the 40-man crew develops in Oregon. the forerunner of the hotshot crew and the smoke jumper program. Again, the need to get controlled by 10 o'clock. Interest at the highest ranks of politics. Here's President Roosevelt himself, who always fancied himself a gentleman forester, approving a new fire prevention campaign featuring Uncle Sam, who looks suspiciously like the character standing next to the poster, who is in fact the artist, James Montgomery Flagg, who modeled Uncle Sam on himself. All this goes to war. Time and again, the fire protection program of the public lands gets militarized and then demilitarized. World War II is a time when it got militarized, all kinds of fire weaponry discovered. The United States is even attacked by fire bomb balloons lofted from Japan. And of course, the war ends with a new fire weapon, the atomic bomb. Many of you may have seen this photo, often reproduced. The lower right, Hiroshima atomic strike, US Army photo. This is not, however, the mushroom cloud of the atomic bomb. This is the pyrocumulus cloud from the burning city that followed the slashing and burning set off by the bomb. So the military began to take a serious interest in fire, in large fires, the behavior of fires, how to start them, how to stop them. And that would feed into a whole project of fire research. Our first national fire prevention campaign also begins 1942 out of alarm in California over possible Japanese incendiary attacks. Pretty hardcore even for the time. Fortunately, Bambi is released at that time, and Bambi takes over the role. 1943, Disney refuses to allow licensing for more than 1 year. So a cartoon character has to be created by committee, by the way, and gave us Smokey Bear in 1944. In 1950, life imitates art, and we get Little Smokey. All that war hardware, particularly after the Korean War, is made available. Forest Service has priority access, and through the Forest Service to the states. So the CCC is gone, but we can now mechanize almost overnight. And we began what we might aptly characterize as a Cold War on fire. Operation Fire Stop, a one-year project, the Forest Service and CAL FIRE set up at Camp Pendleton to systematically convert experiences from the wartime, both in terms of converting equipment, learning lessons for organization, and of course, mobilizing science. Equipment development centers emerge primarily to assist this transfer, and fire labs. We end up with 3 by the early 1960s. And it's clear that some DoD funding and civil defense funding was part of what allowed this to become possible, and also helped to move fire behavior research out of forestry into more physics and chemistry. Even Hollywood joins in 1942 to about the mid-1960s, a whole series of films, perhaps the most famous, Red Skies of Montana, clearly adapting the war story to firefighting. 1947, 250,000 acres burn in rural Maine. A real shock, and a sense that civil defense, which is yet to be organized, but when it is, will consider fire as part of its mandate. I think Maine 47 is the last of the great rural fires. Bel Air, Brentwood, 1961, I would consider the beginning of the modern wildland urban fire. It's a dumb name. We're stuck with it. I would regard this as WUI 1. Lots of interesting things happened. Meanwhile, the Forest Service had pretty much completed its task. Nearly all the states, I think Arizona was the last, yet to come, joined a national matrix with the Forest Service providing the organizing um, um, muscle for it. Almost all research, prevention programs, policy, professional authority, almost everything. The Forest Service had it all. There were only 2 dedicated fire officers in the entire National Park Service at the time. And there was a famous study in public administration in 1960 that identified the Forest Service as a paragon. This is as good as it gets. 50 years later, people will be people interested in public administration and government will be looking at the Forest Service as a model of dysfunctional democracy. What happens? What happens is the same that will happen with fire, although with perhaps more optimistic outcomes. A new era is about to break. Environmental enthusiasm, all the agencies, federal agencies will get new charters. They will each want to manage fire in their own way for their own purposes. A big demographic change is underway, first from the baby boom and then from immigration. And a civil society for fire is created. And the whole public domain is going to move from a kind of multiple use melting pot for which the Forest Service was set up to handle to a more kind of special interest mosaic. And those agencies that have a single task or don't have to reconcile what Congress is unable to reconcile on its own and hand over to the agencies, those that have that single charge will do better. Meantime, observers are noting that there is a lot of ecological decay going on in places that have been deprived of fire, and fuels are building up. It all adds up to what I think of as a fire revolution. It was bicoastal, maybe bipolar. One model emerged in Florida, really targeting working landscapes and prescribed fire. The other came out of California. It was looking at wild landscapes. It was interested in natural fire. Prescribed fire could be used, but only as a means to assist the transition into a more fully natural program. That sets underway a revolution. That's followed by a counter-revolution, a lost decade, rekindles really in 1994. But you'll notice that all these shifts are now with large shifts in political administrations and parties. And finally, I think we're leading it into something else. Well, very quickly, I don't want to spend a lot of time on dates. Kennedy was right. The torch is being passed. 1962, Tall Timbers, a private research operation, begins holding its fire ecology conferences. The name was new. The Nature Conservancy conducted its first burn. So both of these are outside the agencies, and they're doing something different. In 63, the Leopold Report targets fire exclusion in the Sierra Nevada as an emblem of what was wrong in Park Service administration and the need to restore those processes that were fundamental to primitive America. 64, the Wilderness Act creates a whole new category of land and brings with it a new responsibility to fire. All this new environmental legislation, 64 Civil Rights Act, passed, symbolizing a reconstitutional workforce for fire. By 1968, the Park Service had adopted the new policy and made fire restoration its primary goal. As agencies split in their policies, the Forest Service is being challenged. We have to find ways to pool resources during emergencies. 6970 Interagency Fire Center opens. National Wildfire Coordinating Group, talk shop to help all the different agencies and participants find common ground. By 1978, the Forest Service was on board. And by 1980, with the Alaska Lands Act, Alaska is able to start in a serious way in the midst of the fire revolution. So what was this about? Well, it was really a policy of fire by prescription. This could mean deliberate burning, the usual sense of prescribed fire. It could be natural prescribed fire, and don't try to parse the metaphysics here, but the idea was that it should be a way to have some kind of control or prescribed conditions set over the use of fire in wilderness and backcountry areas. And even wildfire itself, multiple options, no longer a 10 a.m. policy uh, has to be, is commanding. You have options to control it in the traditional way or to contain it within certain perimeters or to confine it, which in many ways becomes indistinguishable from a prescribed natural fire. All this by 1978, election in 1980, and we began our polarization. Even the weather begins exceptionally wet, ends exceptionally dry, a long drought that throughout most of the West is still with us. Politics changes, civilian agencies are losing to privatization and to military. At the same time, by the mid 80s, the wildland urban interface is identified and returning. It's, having cities burn like this is like watching a plague reemerge. It's like watching polio come back. This is a problem we thought we had fixed. But I think in many ways it got misdefined. It was defined by the wildland side, who saw houses complicating their land management. It could have been, excuse me, could have been defined as an urban fire with funny landscaping, in which case it's pretty obvious what you have to do to fix it. And by 1987, the Forest Service and National Fire Protection Associations are launching a national initiative, still with us. And we're still a long way from solving it. By the end of the decade, the start of the new one, two major events sort of highlighting what would seem to be the future. Yellowstone burns, maybe 40% of the park burns on and on week after week during the summer of 88. 91, Oakland burns. Excuse me, some open parkland helps to get a fire initiated, and then 795 houses burn in the first hour, and off we go. Interestingly enough, even though the urban side is completely incinerated here, you can see those little patches of parkland. The trees came through fine. Well, the trees are adapted, fire the houses aren't. The catalytic year actually follows another change in administrations and parties. This was 94, our first $1 billion suppression year, and of course the South Canyon tragedy. By the next year, common federal fire policy, building on what was already there, but now linking them, relinking everybody together, is out. Before the decade is out, Secretary of Interior Bruce Babbitt declares we are in a national fire crisis. And then 2000, wildfire once again in the Northern Rockies, 90 years after the big blowup. We still can't stop those fires. All that equipment, all those crews, all that communication, all that science, we can't stop them. At the same time, the National Park Service loses a prescribed fire outside Los Alamos, New Mexico, and burns into the town. And so it would seem we can't light fires or fight them. And following those breakdowns in the waning hours of the Clinton administration, a national fire plan is passed. Not really too little, too much, maybe too much, but certainly too late. Everything is lined against us. As the new millennium starts, the fires are getting bigger. Mega fires, as a term is coined. More communities are threatened, and firefighters continue to die. By this point, the Forest Service is being gutted by a change in the funding mechanism for large fires, and 50% or more of its entire budget is going simply to fight fires. Change of administrations again. By now, new possibilities are around. We'll discuss them in a minute. but it's also the transition to a kind of civil society. Our governmental institutions seem to be more and more disabled and inefficient in many ways by design. Civil society is expected to fill the gap. In some ways, it does. A national cohesive strategy is requested by Congress, but is not funded, not given any political authority. Still, it provides a convenient way for the many, many participants of the fire fire protection forces in the United States to come together. I mean, now we're dealing with volunteer fire departments, county fire departments, rural fire protection districts, states, federal agencies, all kinds of other landowners. Prescribed fire councils are created to help promote prescribed burning, both on public but also private land, continue to spread across the country. Suppression now has its lobby, its organization and lobby for a better support of firefighting. And agencies like the Nature Conservancy, TNC now burns as much as per year as the National Park Service. And it provides a different model, not either a land that's stripped or one that is left in wilderness conditions, but working landscapes, working, however, to promote ecological goods and services. So a lot of intervention possible, really a different way of doing it. A lot of ferment out there, but what's needed still is a way to bring all this together in an organized and coherent way. Well, we should be clear that America doesn't have a fire problem. It's got a lot of fire problems, and they all have different solutions. They all require different approaches. But one of the fascinating things looking at it from my perspective is the way it channels larger cultural events and political events, even our social order. The polarization we see in politics and economics is not unlike what we see in land. A lot of attention to the wild and protected, and the urban, not much to that missing middle landscape. And mega fires, really the 1%ers of nature's fire economy, gobbling up all the resources that might go for other purposes. We do see a division, even in our appreciation or understanding of fire. There's a nice divide. Here in the foreground, Biosphere 2, a completely sustainable world, an engineered world, a model that could be taken to Mars in principle, in a world that has absolutely no place for fire. Partly it's a question of scale, but even conceptually, fire does not figure in this model of the globe. In the background, however, boiling over the Santa Catalina Mountains, we see the Aspen Fire, full-throated burning, a place that needs to burn, does burn, and there seems to be, this pretty well encapsulates the two extremes of our imagination. So the purely wild landscape, here the Sully Complex in the Northern Rockies, 2000, famous photo, the Elk Bath, as it came to be titled. Fire is simply a benign presence, but no people around. And then if we're going to put people in, we're back to Biosphere 2 or its equivalent, and we have urban conflagrations returning. And we have no middle, it seems, no narrative for the middle, no images of the middle, no sort of working narratives of ourselves as the keystone species for fire on the planet, using fire, using our unique firepower to make a more habitable world. Well, I think today we have three general strategies in play. A resistance strategy. Suppression hasn't gone away. It isn't going to go away. It is evolving. It is becoming more an all-hazard emergency service where there are strong pressures because of the threat to communities to make wildland fire follow an urban fire service model. If you want an example of this, I think CAL FIRE would be a good one. But there's a kind of CAL FIRE light has been adopted for the Front Range in Colorado. And we'll see how that works out. But there will be strong pressures to boost suppression and provide protection. Restoration has been a goal for decades now. Some of them, thanks to Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act, can assume large scale, trying to get restoration at scale, changing the context for fires, trying to get ahead of the problem, hardening our assets like communities, encouraging more robust landscapes, and involving more than just prescribed fire, but prescribed burning would be a fundamental part, even if there's some mechanical treatments involved as well. The problem is getting this done, getting the funding, getting the social capital that's required, getting the full political capital to apply it, getting all the pieces to align. The For Forest Restoration Initiative in Arizona was the flagship, 2.5 million acres. They were going to do 50,000 acres a year for 10 years for 500,000 acres. Barely got started, several stumbles. Mostly now they're using managed wildfire to get their treatment done. Some treatment otherwise, but mostly the numbers are coming by a kind of box and burn strategy throughout. And that, I think, it leads me into my third category. Let's call it a resilience model. I think there are many fire officers now and observers who say we have to accept the conditions we're given, play the hand we're dealt. We're not going to get ahead of this. Too many things are coming too fast from too many angles. The fire community is not in charge of any of them. And we're evolving kind of hybrid management, point protection, that is suppression, even on an urban model, and a kind of box and burn for the backcountry or more remote areas, which if done correctly, is not simply a black line, but a prescribed burn done under urgent conditions. So it's a real mashup, a kind of hybrid management. And I think this is really, for much of the public land, the treatment of choice. They're all in play, and which one triumphs, which one wins in any particular situation, it's much like a game of rock, scissors, and paper. There's one last element here that needs to be addressed as well. Humans had always operated in living landscapes, and we had changed fire's domain. We expanded it by cutting, draining, drying, loosing livestock in areas, by our own tendencies to burn, our capacity to ignite. But there were always constraints, ecological baffles and barriers. We couldn't exceed it because we are feeding fire off living biomass. And as long as we're in that ecosystem, there are checks and balances on what can burn and how. But in an effort to expand our firepower, we began going into the geologic past, or what I think of now as lithic landscapes. Once living landscapes that are now fossilized into coal and petroleum and other fossil fuels, and burning those. And these have no boundaries. You can burn day and night, winter and summer, rain or sun, wind or fog, it doesn't matter. And all the old borders are gone. The amount available to burn is essentially unbounded, and the only containment possible for all the stuff we're releasing is the planet itself. We are, in effect, cooking the earth. So megafires have now joined our forlorn polar bear as an emblem not only of climate change, but of an Anthropocene. But I would argue that what we're really talking about is a fossil fuel civilization. It supplies our energy sources. It's the basis on which we organize our land, our farming, our protected sites. So many ecological pathologies trace themselves back to our reliance, our overabundance, our binge burning of fossil fuels. Hey, even our suppression. Suppose we took away all those airplanes and bulldozers and helicopters and engines and water tenders and pumps, chainsaws. What kind of fire protection could we manage? We couldn't pretend to try to offer a counterforce to nature's fires. We would have to do what humans had always done. We would have to manage the landscape and we would have to substitute our own fires. Even our prescribed burning, by the way, is done with fossil fuels. It's kind of creepy. One of the great examples I like of these two realms of burning colliding are the number of power lines that start fires, carrying power from one source across a different landscape and with often lethal results. And I think we can expect lots of novel ecosystems in the future. I think when you add up all of our combustion practices, all that we're doing in living landscapes and all that we're doing with lithic landscapes, we're creating the fire equivalent of an ice age, complete with changes in sea level, mass extinctions, large scale shifts in biogeography, the equivalent of outwashed plains and list fields in the form of smoke, giant smoke palls, or what I've taken to calling a pyrocene. But as we move into the future, I'll offer one final thought. Yeah, all of the problem fires that we see, including the pyrocene, is a result of our management or mismanagement of fire, our unique capacity, our species monopoly over combustion. But as it's not something that has a fix, a final end point. And I'm often reminded of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, who declaimed, "They shall go out from one fire, and another fire shall devour them." We will always be caught between fires. That is, I think, what it means to be human. So with that, I'll thank you for your patience, and I think we still have time for questions. Doug?
Yeah, thank you for that very insightful and very informative little presentation on the history of fire in the US. To open up the Q&A, let's start out with um, this latest fire in California. A lot of the news sources have been saying how like the smoke will potentially even reach Europe if it hasn't already from the California fires. So with the fact that some of our fires now and those mega fires will have global impacts, do you think there needs to be some kind of a global effort to maintain these landscapes and stuff like that, not only just in the US, but other areas where wildfires are prone and these mega fires are starting to pop up more and more, such as Australia?
Well, that's a good question. There are lots of reasons to protect much of our, particularly our old growth and mature forests, simply for storing carbon, but also all the other ecological services they provide. But we ought to distinguish between those fires which are being set to clear land, as for example in Amazonia or Indonesian peatlands, and even large fires in places like California. Fire is paradoxically is conservative. It renews, and what comes back afterwards is what was there before. It may take a while, but generally, if the conditions remain the same, part of the issue now is that the conditions are not remaining the same. And in places where you have invasive grasses, this could be a problem. So we're losing stored carbon. But one way to protect those, many of these forests, is by thinning, getting fire in so that the carbon that is stored there is not released in these great spasms. Even after many of these fires have blasted through the canopies, the tree trunks are there. They will decompose, but it's a slower process. So that is a different project. That is a different problem in terms of carbon than, say, Indonesia or Brazil or burning fossil fuels. That is what needs to be stopped. These other fires, we need better control for lots of reasons. Uh, and one of the ways we're going to be able to secure those places is by doing a lot of burning, prescribed burning, managed wildfires. Um, we need to expand our whole range of what restored fire can look like. There are lots of ways. So it's a paradox, and we shouldn't, the media, because fires are so graphic and visceral and will grab eyeballs, is always going to focus on the fires. And then you think, oh, all these fires are the same. They are not the same. They are not having the same consequences. And we need to distinguish among them.
And I think that brings up a really good point about the way the media is portraying them. Like you said, how they're all one gigantic fire, when in reality they're multiple fires having separate effects.
Yeah. And they have different responses. It's not just one response. Oh, we need to put out fires in the Amazon. I mean, is that really a fire problem? Is that something that could be solved by sending down air tankers and hotshot crews? No, that's a problem of political economy. It's a problem of land use. Fire is an enabling technology, but it's not fundamentally a fire problem. Same in Indonesia and some other areas. Um, Same with fire in the boreal forest. Fire in tundra, that's pretty rare. We're starting to see more of it. That's worrying. Fire melting permafrost, yeah, that could be worrying. But fire in the boreal forest, no. Fire, that's what boreal forests do. They burn. So we need to be able to discriminate all these. What happens instead, I think, is that fire is so graphic it gets hijacked for other agendas. And so we're not really proposing fire solutions. We're using fire to animate some other message. And the image I have is of all these people standing around this big fire and pointing to the fire, but they actually have their backs to it. And they're using the fire to help broadcast some message to their special group. And what we need is for everybody to turn around and talk to one another over the fire we share. That isn't happening.
Yeah. And then is there any kind of public policy figure in the West, or just anywhere in the US that's really grappling with the public policy questions presented by our fire policy right now? And then does anyone really like get what's going on right now?
Well, I'm not sure who you mean by who the agent of this is. We've had a policy for 40 to 50 years that is adequate for what we need to do. It
Mm-hmm.
has been a problem of getting not just the money, but the social capital, getting political interest, not stalling, trying to roll back things. We have a bill recently, it's been introduced by Senators Wyden and Cantwell, I believe, from the Northwest, um, to expand prescribed burning, to provide some greater opportunities and funding for that. That's great. It's not really a policy problem. It's a problem of sort of freeing up the resources to make it possible. And that isn't solved by dismantling regulations. They're there for a reason. We could certainly expand our NEPA process. We need larger areas and longer periods of time. Right now, prescribed fire is done as a set piece, designated spot, designated time. And if anything's out of sync on the checklist, you don't do it. We need to be able to do whole landscapes over longer periods of time. So when the opportunity presents itself, you can move. So that's that's a change of tactics. We need sort of approval. We need to tweak it so things like that can be done. Florida changed liability law 30 years ago, which put a bias really in favor of burning. We can change liability law. That's not written in nature. That's for us. There are lots of things we can do. Things like that, uh, enabling people who are trying to burn, make it easier for them to do it in a good way. There are lots of things that could be done right now. People, as I say, fire keeps being hijacked for all these other agendas, and so we're not solving the fire problem because we're too busy arguing over other stuff.
Yeah. And then many of the fires in California are in oak woodlands. Is prescribed fire an appropriate tactic for those ecosystems?
Yeah, they were managed for um, probably thousands of years. Um, and regularly burned, and that was part of acorn harvesting. It was part of those landscapes, and we could certainly do that again. In many ways, they're particularly if they're not overgrown with some kind of understudy. But if they're a true oak savanna, then that's pretty easy to burn. We should be able to do that. Um, and that smoke may be a nuisance. It may be a seasonal nuisance like seasonal allergies, but that's better than being locked in your house for weeks because of the smoke outside is unhealthy. I saw notice in Denver they were advising people to have safe rooms where you can go to avoid the smoke. Really? Has it come to
Yeah.
that? We're prepared to do that, but we're not prepared to deal in a coherent way with the deeper problem. Apparently,
Yeah, so most like just give a little bit to prevent the worst aspect.
it's not that hard. I think if people were presented with honest choices about it, I mean, there are always going to be loud mouths and blowhards who want to use anything for their own personal publicity, uh, but most people, I think, will be reasonable about it. We need to put our resources where communities, municipal watersheds, and so forth are threatened, and that means putting it at the community, hardening these structures. It's not we know the science, and some of this we've known for a whole for a very long time, um, and then demonstrate that we're not putting you at risk. We need to do these things, but we also need to take care of the backcountry. Otherwise, the only fires that will come will be fires that are so extreme we can't protect you at all.
Mm-hmm.
That's not protecting you. We need to do both. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's that hard, really. I mean, people recognize the difference between a flood and an irrigated field. They can recognize the difference between a wildfire and a prescribed burn.
And I almost wonder if part of that's because of the visual impact of just seeing a fire, like what that does to you. Because for me, like if I saw an irrigated field versus like a full scale flood, like the visual impact of an irrigated field isn't that shocking to me. Like I wouldn't be like, oh no, like that's bad. Whereas if I just see a fire while, in a controlled way, like there still has that same visual impact of a wildfire. So I wonder if there's almost that like psychological component playing in.
Well, there may be, but people are drawn to fire. I mean, fire is one of the most. I mean, those who share a fireside used to be the definition of a family.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I mean, there are a few things that are more inviting than a campfire. People get very mellow around it. It's not that we have one image of fire, and it's terrifying. Fire is a shapeshifter. It's sort of nature is postmodernist. It's all about context, and we just have to a little education, but we also need some different narratives. We need to get people so that prescribed fire or managed fire can be as interesting and exciting in a sense as wildfire. We don't need war stories that served us ill in terms of fire. But when Hollywood produces an action film that stars a prescribed burner, then I know we'll have turned the corner. But until then, you're just not going to have the same kind of dramatic or moral uh, challenge to it. And in a sense, prescribed fire shouldn't be exciting in the same way because that's the whole point of it. It's the case if you did it right, so it's not news.
And then do you think that there should be significant policy focus on adaptation response development? And then what do you think the ratio between adaptation and mitigation efforts should be?
Well, I think these have to be decided on a place-by-place basis. I
Hmm.
don't think there's any universal prescription. The home ignition zone, Jack Cohen developed and others have demonstrated over and over again is where to begin protecting communities. I've suggested you expand that to a kind of more defensible space and recognition that this is a social problem. You know, fire is a contagion. It's a kind of contagion of combustion. We can model it that way. So unless your neighbors are also uh, following, wearing their masks and practicing social distancing, you're going to fail. Um, so I've suggested a kind of housing environmental risk zone or HERS. So we have his and hers, and together they can kind of provide a defensible uh, place for our communities. And there are lots of ways to do this. We just sort of have, what we really need is a mechanism to talk about it. And then for the countryside, I think once people recognize that you're not putting them recklessly at risk, they will appreciate it. And you just need to do it. And we need to free up space to do that. Uh, the policy reforms that appeared in the 60s and 70s, pretty much consolidated by 78, needed space. They needed some geographic space to try. They needed some political and bureaucratic space. They needed some social space. They didn't get it. Things changed, and that didn't happen. And so by the time we were able to restart or rekindle the project in the mid 90s, um, everything has turned against us. The 70s and 80s were really the last chance we had, I think, nationally to to move in a large reforming way. I'm varying from your question. Even though I'm talking about large stuff, what I want to emphasize is that it's all on a site by site basis. I mean, the
Hmm.
north side of a hill is going to be different than the south side. The top's different than the bottom. You need to adjust it. And we
Yeah.
need to be able to do our burning by people who actually know that landscape in that way.
Yeah, there's no one blanket way to solve it.
Yeah, it's going to be different everywhere. California's fire suppression model does not work in Florida. Florida's prescribed burning model has not worked in most of the West. It's not for lack of trying. It's just that it's different,
Hmm.
and we need a different way to get fire in. So there's a lot of opportunity. I think if we could remove some of the impediments, a lot of it would begin shaping itself.
And then our last question for the night is, will future laws restrict mankind from moving into wooded areas? It seems fires become really dangerous when people's homes are in the path of a fire.
Well, I wouldn't put a lot of money on that, particularly in this country. We People are going to build wherever they want. We've had very little success uh, protecting coastal zones subject to hurricanes and tropical storms. We've had really at best minor luck in floodplains, um, some success in building codes in earthquake zones, but generally no. We're not going. People are going to move, but we can certainly do a better job. Um, and part of the issue so far has been a narrative of Westerners. Western fire is a problem of dumb Westerners building houses where there are fires. But thanks to climate change and land use, the fires are going to where the houses are. Bastrop County, Texas, Gatlinburg, Tennessee, for heaven's sakes, communities on the coastal plains in Georgia and Florida and so forth are now experiencing large and threatening fires in ways that had not been true before. So it's not just a Western problem. And I think it's important to expand the narrative nationally so it doesn't get quarantined off as a California quirk or something that happens out West. It doesn't affect everybody else.
Yeah, it's something that we all need to be paying attention to, regardless of where we are.
And there are a lot of things, a lot of things we need to do with fire. It's not just that we need to do this for fire. It's probably not a good idea to sprawl urban everywhere. it's fragmenting habitats. It's doing a lot of damage for other things. How many of our bad fires have started from power lines? There's no excuse for power lines to be starting fires.
Mhm.
We need to fix the grid anyway. We've known we've needed to fix it for a couple of decades. Well, maybe fire could act as a catalyst socially as it does ecologically, and provide an added incentive to do things we should be doing anyway. So we don't need $1 trillion program to deal with fire. We need lots of little programs to start chipping away at the things that are contributing to the problem. And many of these we need to do for other reasons as well. Even if fire didn't exist, we would need to do them.
Yeah, I think that's a very insightful way to put it and a very great way to round off tonight's conversation. So I wanted to say thank you again for having this talk with me, Steve, and thank you to everyone who attended tonight.
Well, thanks for the invitation, and to all of the viewers. Have a good
Have a
night.
good night.
Okay, bye-bye.